Today, however, it's a little bit of a different story with some pretty well documented engine issues with this Cummins engine, as well as now having driven and towed all of the diesel engine in the segment under load. It gives me a pretty good perspective as to why I'm just not as high on this standard output Cummins engine as I used to be. The first reason why this engine finds itself on the bottom of my list is because of the lifter failures this Cummins engine is experiencing. I've talked about it a number of times on the channel, but in 2019 when Cummins last updated this engine, they switched to a hydraulic roller lifter, ditching the rather simpler flat tappet style lifter. And unfortunately, the new hydraulic roller lifter has turned out to be a weak point in this engine. Other issues that I've personally seen with these Cummins engine include your turbo VGT actuator failing. Not an easy job, not cheap either. The coolant and oil lines going to your Holset turbo, for whatever reason up here in this climate, just seem to get pretty rotten. And lastly is the EGR valve. Seems to get full or clogged with soot pretty frequently, and it'll throw a bunch of check engine lights, or the EGR valve will just outright fail. Speaking of EGR, emission issues are pretty much par for the course across all engines of the diesel segment. But there is one thing unique about this Cummins engine, and it is how it performs a regen. Now, a regen, for anyone who doesn't know, is when there's too much soot built up in the DPF and it has to be burned off. Typically, what we see is raw diesel fuel actually injected right into the DPF or right before the DPF. It gets super hot, clears that soot out, and you move on with your life. This Cummins engine, however, does not directly spray diesel into the DPFs. This engine instead uses all 6 injectors and sprays diesel fuel into the engine during the exhaust stroke, and it gets pushed out of the engine into the exhaust down into the DPF to be then burned during the regen process. And there's a couple things that I don't really like about that. First, you run the risk of potentially washing down your cylinder walls. Secondly, you could make the argument that you're potentially going to build up some more carbon or sludge on the exhaust system as well as the turbo because you're pushing that raw fuel out through those components. The main problem, however, I have with this style of regen is diluting your oil with fuel. Trucks that are regenning somewhat frequently are going to have a greater possibility of fuel diluting their oil, because as you're spraying that raw fuel into the engine during the exhaust stroke, some of that fuel will make its way past the piston ring and find its way into your oil. And if you're not changing your oil on a regular basis, you run the risk of potentially damaging some engine components. Usually the canary in the coal mine is your turbo. Those bearings will see the first sign of wear if there is any major fuel dilution in your oil.